Welcome to another Access Extension Framework tutorial on updating the backend. Now there's a bit of a procedure involved in this, so I'm going to go over the principles of the backend updates first. So each backend has a version number. You can see here it's version 3 in our example. And the front end carries scripts to update each version to the next, each backend version. So the front end here will have scripts to update version 0 to 1, 1 to 2, and 2 to 3. When the front end starts up, it checks the back end to see if it's the latest version. And if it isn't the latest, then it will run the necessary scripts to bring it up to date. And it can cope with multiple version upgrades. So for example, if it encounters a version 0 backend, it can just run 3 scripts to update it to version 3. So you can see here the front end's version 5. The front end is used for delivery of backend updates. But a front-end release doesn't necessarily have to upgrade the back end. Quite often it's just a change to forms or something fairly cosmetic. So let's have a look at an example of a fictional customer site. I've called this Site 1, and this has got a back end and several front ends hanging off it on different machines. Now you may have multiple sites. It's not uncommon to have an application that's deployed to multiple customer sites, and this whole process allows you to issue one update for everybody. You can often do that via the web. So the mechanism for front-end update is that there's a designated folder on the network that contains the front-end updates. And every time a front-end starts up, it will look in that update folder and check the version number of the application that's there. Now, if it's a newer version than what the front-end is already, then it will automatically upgrade itself. So what we can see here is the stable configuration for the client. This is pre any kind of upgrade, where the version in the update folder is the same as the front ends. So when they start up, they'll do nothing. So the next step is for the developer to use their copy and produce an update. So here we're going to upgrade the back end to version 4, and the front end automatically goes to the next version, which is version 6. And that's going to contain a script which will upgrade the back end from 3 to 4. The next step is deployment of that update to the customer, where it goes into their update folder. So when the customer front end starts up, it'll check in the updates folder, notice there's a more recent version, and automatically upgrade and close itself. Now when that version's restarted, it will notice that the backend is version 3, but it now supports version 4, so it will run an upgrade script to upgrade the backend to version 4. Quite often in this step it's necessary for the front end to have exclusive access to the backend, so you may have to get everybody to log out at this point. So that basically completes the upgrade, and then the last scenario is that the additional front ends for the customer will upgrade themselves to the latest front end version. Obviously, because the back end's already at version 4, they won't run the upgrade script again. There's one caveat we should note, which is that a front end won't work or won't connect to a back end version that's later than it supports. So for example, if there was something preventing the upgrade process from occurring in this back end, it would still remain at version 1.005, which supports backend version 3. That would refuse to start up because it recognizes backend version 4 has got changes that it doesn't know about, and rather than risk errors and possible data corruption, it will just refuse to start up until the point where it's updated. So that's only ever going to occur where one front end gets updated, upgrades the back end, and for some reason the second front end fails to update. Okay, so let's run through an example of upgrading a database back end. So the first thing we want to do with our developer copy is make a copy of the back end. And this is backend version 3 for this application, so I'll just give that a sensible name. What we're going to use that for is testing later on. When we've developed version 4, we want to test running the update script. So now we'll go ahead and make the changes we want to this version of the backend. What I plan to do is I want to add a new foreign key to this table. So this body table is for a governing body or some kind of legal entity. What I want to do is add a head office country foreign key field to it. This will be an ID, so the country table will have an ID and a country name. Okay, so the first thing we really need to do, actually, let's save this. We don't really care about the data that's in there at the moment. We can take care of that later when we do the scripting. But what we'll do now is we'll create a new table, the country table. So I've created these two fields and given it a primary key. We'll save that as table country. And one of the first things I'll do is go and just add some samples to it. Now that's fine. I just want a few samples here. This is obviously not a realistic country table. Normally you would use ISO country codes and you'd have a whole list. But this is something I'm just putting together as a demonstration. So we've got this, and that's probably enough over here, this foreign key. What we might do at this point is add the relationship. So I'll close this table and we'll go to the relationship. The country table's here already. I'm just going to drag this relationship in here and enforce referential integrity. So I've made this a required field, non-nullable, and it probably actually is null in the table at the moment, but we'll fix all that up when we do the scripting. What I'm doing here really is just using the GUI to create a lot of the structures and data we need so that it's easy to script later on. Alright, so the next step is to go into the front end and we'll add that country table that we just created to the linker. Now the easiest way I find to get into the control center is to hit Control G for an immediate window, and then xf.cc will start up the control center for us. And under linker tables, so we've got a table linker that's part of the Access Extension Framework. It's really the best way to link all your tables and make sure that the tables are kept linked, because it is automatically used by the upgrade process. So when we're upgrading a front end, for example, the new front end may be from your development environment, which has a different set of links, is linked to a different back end, and the table linker will automatically go through and link it to the correct back end. So it's really a fairly integral part of the whole update process. One of the reasons it was originally developed is because the Access Link Table Manager, which lives in here, in the old days there was quite often in installations on client machines it would not be installed, it was optional, and you'd find you didn't have a link table manager, and in that case it becomes quite a complex task to link a new table from a back end. I think these days it's more generally installed, but it's much easier if we just stick to the extension framework way of doing things. Okay, and now we can say link refresh this front end. And you'll notice here we've now got the country table. And also if we go and just have a quick check in the body field, you'll notice we've got this head office country in here as well. It's the one we just added. So let's just have a quick look at the auto start function. So that's a framework function that is designed to run every time the application starts up, and that does critical things for the framework, like checking to see if front-end updates need to be done, checking for back-end updates. It does a range of other things which can be turned on or off through the control center. So we really need, in applications that use the extension framework, to run this on startup. So you'll probably be aware that if there is a macro with the name AutoExec in Access, then that's automatically executed on startup. But what I usually do nowadays is configure it to open the splash screen, which does the same thing. So let's have a quick look in here. And you can see it runs the app startup function there. And app startup does a few different things. This is in the app specific module, which is a module I usually configure just for things that are specific to this application. So this is the XF auto start function. This is the critical line which you need to include. But what I've done is put this app startup function in a module, and I've added a couple of other things to it. So we want to hide the navigation bar there, minimize the ribbon, and we've got some reporting weeks that we need to fill. So these are all application specific things, but the important thing is that we actually call this auto start function at some point. And if we go back quickly to the macro, let's have a quick look there. And what this is doing is running app startup, which again is that function we just saw, and then it's opening the main form. So it's essentially the same action. So the next step is to script up the changes we've made to the back end. You can see there's a few back-end scripts here. These are the ones we were talking about earlier to upgrade the different versions of the database. What I'm going to do is just choose one, and then I'll type in the new name. So this will be version 3 to 4. That'll create it for us. We've got to go select the back end. So it is possible that the front end may have more than one back end attached to it, and we can have collections of scripts here to update each back end separately. They may all have different versions, and we can they're all kept track of independently of each other. In this case, we're just upgrading the single backend to version 4. Now, the next thing is to generate the script information. We may have to click refresh here to show that new country table. Just to give a quick overview of this screen, this is where you can generate SQL scripts to create any of your database objects. And we can script schemas, which is the structure of the table. We can script insert statements and update statements. There's also the option for a binary update here, so that's not something natively supported by SQL. So let's script up a schema for the country table. That's pretty simple. And then we can cut and paste that into our script here. That's just dropping the table at the start if it exists. That's in case we want to rerun this multiple times. It's adding a primary key, and the auto number fix, we'll keep that just as a reminder for later on, but I'll talk about that in a minute. Let's go back to the script generator, and the other thing we want to do is generate that new column on the body table. So we'll script that schema as well. In this case though, we don't really want most of this. We don't want to create the table, we just want to create that one column. So I'll modify this a little bit. We'll make this an alter table statement instead of a create table. And we're going to add the column information, which is further down here. So the other thing we need to do is grab that foreign key constraint. We'll put that over. You notice we need the word go after each separate statement. Now we're getting close here. The remaining thing to do is to get the data out of the country table. So let's script an insert statement for that. In this case, we can use an identity insert. So what that is that's actually going to insert the information in the country ID table. Because that's an auto ID, normally they would be assigned automatically, but we do have the option to explicitly insert the values, and we'll do that this time because of what we're about to do. Now, what I want to do is, you'll notice that the foreign key here is not nullable, which means it must always be selected. But we do want to give the user the option not to select a country. It's possible that you may want to force them to select a country, but that will initially mean that we've got to get a list of countries off them, and we've got to put that into the database, which we could do. We could fill that data in, and then we could script up an update statement to update all of the existing data. But it is probably easier just to give them the option to leave this empty. Now, one way to do that is allow this to be nullable, but it's better practice to include what's called a sentinel value in the data. So let's do that. So I usually use the value -10. It's a bit of a magic number, but the negative values tend not to be used. And I usually use -10 to indicate nothing, and then there are various other Sentinel values you may wish to use. Usually for application-specific purposes, I usually go from -10 downwards, so -11, 12, so forth for those values. And I usually make sure that there are no values in the -1 to 9 range. It can be handy to know that there is not a value in the database for those things. So what the auto number fix does here is there actually is a bug when you go inserting identity values into a linked table. In some versions of Access, it will actually reset the seed value. So for example, if I went and ran this command, the -10, the new values in the table would then start at -9 and so forth, and that it's very easy for those to overwrite existing values and cause error messages. So this auto number fix is a way of fixing that bug. It just goes in and checks the maximum value in the table and makes sure that the seed is greater than that value. So I think we've got all our ducks in a row here. The only thing really is to add a default to this table, and we want that to default to -10. So initially we're going to make sure that this is not nullable, it can't be null, but we're going to default it to what is essentially an empty value. So let's save this. Oh, and the final thing to do is to generate an update statement to set the values in the body field. So it's probably just as easy to script this manually actually. So what we're doing here is setting up the existing values to be empty. After this they'll probably be null, even though it's marked as a not null field. Access will kind of work around that and allow nulls to exist, even though it might give you a warning message, which is not a good thing. So we're just updating all the existing data to the empty value. And then it'll be up to the client to go through and set them to something meaningful. It is also possible that this could be just a temporary measure, so perhaps once the clients set all these up to meaningful countries, we could go back and remove the -10 value and make that no longer an option, which would mean that when a new record's being added, they'd have to select a country explicitly rather than just leaving it to the default. We'd remove that default as well. So we'll go to the linked databases page, and the final thing we need to do in order to test the backend update is we'll tell it that this governance backend is now at version 4. So this is a really critical setting for each backend in the framework in the front end here. It governs what versions of the backend databases this front end is compatible with. And as we mentioned earlier, if it encounters a later version than what this number here designates, it'll refuse to work with it because it recognizes that a later version has changes that it doesn't know about. And if it encounters a backend with an earlier version, then it will run the internal scripts to upgrade it. So this essentially defines a particular version of the backend database that this front end is compatible with. So we can now close the control center and we'll give this a test run. Close down the front end. I'm going to make a copy of this backed up version, and this is our current backend that we've kind of hacked up, so I'll just save that as a backup in case. And we're replacing the backend with the old version. So let's start up. This is our splash screen and the normal startup. And this is the screen we get when it's detected that the backend needs to be upgraded. So let's hit OK. And one or more script errors occurred. So we've had an error here. Okay, so when script errors occur, there is some information logged to the immediate window, but most of the time it'll be on a remote machine, often at a client site, and you're not going to have access to that information. So let's just have a look at how we would go about diagnosing it. Now the framework has a logging procedure when an error occurs. First of all, when the error handling function is called, it attempts to log to this table, the shared error log table. Let's just have a quick look in there. And then if it can't do that, sometimes, particularly in cases of relinking where the back end is no longer connected, it will fall back to the local error log table. And one of the things that the startup function does every time the application starts is copy anything that's in the local error log to the shared error log. So when the back end is relinked, the error messages will end up here in the error log table. So if we open up the control center, we will see here in the error logs, we can see the script that we've just run here, and then the error we can see is this one here, default value not found. Now I've actually deliberately put this one in. The problem is that we should have enclosed the -10 in quotes. So if we fix that up, I think that will fix up this script. So these other two errors will disappear once we fix this up. Okay, so let's just go back and have another look at this script, and we'll add the quotes to the -10 and save the script, and we should be right. And I'd like to go through another way of running these scripts, which is a little bit more controlled. So we're going to close out of the front end, and we'll go back and rerun what we just did. I think we can confident enough to get rid of this old experimental back end there. We'll get rid of this one, and we'll roll back to version 3 again, so we can test out the update. So this time I'm going to hold down Shift to bypass the startup process. That way it's not going to run the upgrade for us, and we'll go into the control center. Okay, so we've patched that script. That's looking good now. And I just want to go over how you manually execute scripts. We've got this window here which gives you a lot of different options. You can execute it against the current database, that is the front end, an external access database, so we can browse and execute the script against any arbitrary external database. We've got a few options here executing it as a DAO pass-through query. So this will be in the case of ODBC data sources, which will usually be an SQL Server database. We've got several different options there. So you need to, in this case, you just need to fill in the server name and the database name and any other information in the connect string line. And then another handy feature is, if you recall the linked databases here, we've got these backends that are linked by the table manager. When we execute the scripts, a list of all the linked databases appears here as well. So if we just want to execute against the back end, we can choose that database and it automatically knows where it is. So let's execute our script. It's got quite a few safeguards to stop us doing this automatically. And I've ticked here, only show results for commands where an error occurs. There were no errors, so it hasn't shown us anything. So what that tells us is that our script has run successfully. So one other thing I should mention is the temporary script in here. So I've got a script I've just called temp. I've created this one, and it's just used for, if you want to test particular parts of your script, you don't have to necessarily run it all as a block. You can just test little sections of it if you want. I just cut and paste it into here, and then I use the execute scripts window to execute that against a back end as a test. So we've successfully run this upgrade script. The only problem with what we've just done is, because it wasn't part of the upgrade process, it won't have marked this as 1.4. So when we start up, it'll probably try to rerun that script. So the thing to do now is we'll just close out and we'll blow this back end away again and recopy the old version. Now this time when it starts up, it should do so successfully. So there we have a successful back-end update run. So the final thing to do is go and make sure that that new data is part of the associations form. This one's linked up to the body table in the back end. You can see I've already gone and done this. It's simple enough. It's just a matter of, let's pop this into design mode. And all we've really done is just copy one of these forms and attach it to the new data item here, and select the new data source for it. So we'll just leave that like it is, and give it a bit of a test. So you can see it's displaying that Sentinel value for nothing. Let's go through a few of these and add the values. There you can see that's working just fine. So we're pretty much ready now to deploy this to the customer. You can see we're up to back-end version 4 now, but we're still on 1.005 for the front end, which is the old one. So the last thing to do before we deploy is to bump that front-end version up, so that will trigger a front-end upgrade at the client site. Now the way I usually do this is Control-G for the immediate window, and in the command list there's something called bump front-end app version. So that bumps it up to version 6. Now, you can also pass a parameter to that. For example, if I accidentally do it twice and go to 007, I can pass a parameter of -1, and that'll actually decrease it by 1 instead. So, but that's what we want. We want it to be version 6. That's pretty much it. Okay, so we're ready to deploy this update to the client site now, and I've set up a simulation of a client site. We've got the governance front end in the My Documents folder. I find you either have to put it there or on a shared personal drive to fulfill the Windows and Office requirements for security. But the back end is stored on this shared drive here, shared drive F in the governance subfolder, in the data subfolder, and then in the update subfolder here we've got a copy of the front end. So this folder is the one that will be monitored to see if there's a new front end that requires updating. So let's just have a look at what this front end does in its stable configuration. So at the moment it's at 1005, 1003. That's obviously what's in the update folder as well. We'll just quickly have a look here. And you can see here in shared settings, the location for front-end updates is F governance update, which is indeed this folder here, which we've chosen. So I want to have a look at what happens when we drop the new version of the database from the development environment into the update folder, replacing the existing one. I've got a web tool that does this from the internet, so I can FTP this file up to my website, and then the tool will automatically download the file, unzip it, and replace the existing update file. So when we go back in here, splash screen, and then we get a message about the database being updated. So this is the front end update. This will be updating this front end to version 1006. Okay, now we have to manually reopen that. And then now that we're at 1006, it's detecting that we're at version 3 on the back end, and we're going to do the back end update. And then this is an important step. So you'll notice that when we copied this governance database, it was actually linked to our development back end on drive D. So what the framework has done is automatically detect that the previous front end was linked, this My Documents front end was linked to this back end here on shared drive F, and it has automatically gone and relinked all the tables to that back end on shared drive F for us. So that all happens transparently as part of the upgrade process. And you can see now we're at 1.6004. And that's pretty much all there is to delivering backend update scripts.